Welcome to Repeatable Revenue, a show for online entrepreneurs, remote business builders, and those that are aspiring to be. I'm your host, Ray Green, and on this podcast, I'm going to share everything that I've learned and am learning about building my online business from a remote Mexican beach. Hey, welcome to the show. And today I'm really excited to introduce Bob Perkins. Bob is a very good friend of mine. He's a mentor and he's been an advisor to me across different companies. He has spent his entire career selling stuff to people. Sometimes that's been political ideas. Sometimes it's been fashion. Sometimes it's been pizza. But the bulk of his career has been creating structures, creating strategies to effectively and efficiently sell stuff to people, and doing that by taking a holistic look at the business and the organizations that he's working with. He's been a senior marketing executive and CMO at household names like Playboy, Pizza Hut, Calvin Klein. He's been a founder and mentor to many startups, and he's been an advisor to several of the most influential people in Washington, D.C. And I'm really excited to bring his ideas, his thought process, and some of his perspectives to you. So without further ado, let's dive in. If you're out there and you're trying to learn, how do you know when to pivot and change directions and know that there may just be some cost in starting over versus no, you've got to stay the course and push through some of this and keep the consistency to get the flywheel in motion?
I think, go back to strategy and tactics for a second. I think strategies have to be decided very slowly and tactics can be discarded relatively quickly. If somebody came to me and said, gee, I've done 10 interviews and here's my strategy, I'd say, let's do 10 more. In other words, picking a strategy is like getting married. It's not impossible to divorce yourself, but it's a huge pain in the butt. And so I would be very cautious before I lock down on a strategy. Once I lock down on it, I'd be very reluctant to change it. Whereas a tactic like LinkedIn, I'll buy 100 ads and I'll see what happens. And if it doesn't work, I'll move on. You got to give it a fair, you can't say I'll buy one ad, but you don't have to buy 1,000. You have to have some reasonable time frame to test it. So I'm very slow to change strategies and very quick to change tactics, assuming I have good data. And if you didn't have good data, then you should go back and reevaluate why you're doing it in the first place. Because if you don't know how well it's performing, then it's tough to know whether you should change or not. But I think the question that I've gotten fascinated with, to change gears a little bit, but into the how do you change strategy? What happens when there's a huge exogenous variable dropped in your lap? So I'm fascinated by Chat GPT. And to blow my own horn, the first thing I said is this is going to be the end of Google. And of course, the front page of the New York Times business section 2 days ago was Google is scared completely of Chat GPT. I felt like they should have called me. I could have saved them some time. But if you're a content creator and you're using content creation to drive leads, how is that going to impact your outcome? So that's a gray area. That's really hey, I'm not changing my strategy. I'm still going after a certain kind of business that when they open my website, when they read me, they know exactly whether they're in my target audience or not. But how is that going to impact? How is the availability of virtually instantaneous commentary, which Chat GPT is, and it's usually pretty good, actually. How's that going to change my tactics of using LinkedIn as a funnel? That's a tough question. There's no obvious question to that. You know, when I was at Calvin Klein, you were in the fashion business. And the good news about the fashion business is the bad news. The good news, we had Mr. Klein had a very clear vision, but some quarters we were in sync with what the people were buying and we sold a lot of stuff. And some quarters we weren't, and we couldn't sell a lot of stuff. And truth be told, our advertising wasn't going to change that. There were just so when the buyers came back from the first big fabric show in January, which is where the colors for the following spring season were being picked, and said it's mauve this summer, next winter. Mr. Klein said, "I hate mauve. I'm not using it." That was a vision decision. How did you as a business person incorporate that reality into your go forward plans for the business? That's a toughie. Those are tough calls. But they at least having a clear vision and a clear mission and a clear strategy, it made the tactic discussion a lot easier because nobody got together in a room and said, okay, we're all going to put together a big deck and make Mr. Klein, because we knew it was a waste of time. Let's spend all that time thinking of something that we can get him to buy into. He was a pretty flexible guy when it came down to a lot of stuff, particularly advertising. That's the difference between a good business person, a good consultant, a good business person, and an average one. You're not talking about what sets people apart. It's their ability to succeed in uncertainty. And I think we all do ourselves a disservice by not recognizing up front that many answers aren't very straightforward. There are processes you can put in place, there are things you can put in place, there are ways to maximize the value of success. I used to say, I still do say, the job of a campaign manager was to maximize the probability of winning the election. But that meant you could lose the election and be a great campaign manager because you moved the probability of winning from 10% to 70%, but you lost 70% chance of winning. You lose one out of three times. Whereas somebody else could move a 80% chance of victory to a 40% chance of victory and squeak through and look like a rock star. The job is to maximize the probability of success, and that is once you get the blocking and tackling and the basics out of the way and you clean up a lot of the stuff, you're still left with some very thorny issues. And
Reminds me of another book you recommended to me, Annie Duke's Thinking in Bed.
oh,
And
yeah,
like the
absolutely.
example that I use all the time, it's just because like if you play your hand the way that you're supposed to play your hand perfectly, it doesn't mean that you're going to win every single bet. It's just the nature of business, it's the nature of poker. And she uses the example of if you drive home drunk one night and you make it home safely, does it mean it was that's like the right decision? Obviously not. Like you wouldn't systematize that, but it's the fallacy of only using results to back into things too, because the fact is it's not black or white. It's not I played this hand, ergo every time I play this hand I'm going to get this outcome. It's not that simple. And that's why it's like this whole discussion about the truth is really in the gray area, and it's very contextual, and it depends on where you're at and what your strategy is and what your vision is.
And that's where luck starts to rear its ugly head in an unpredictable way. I thought I had a great strategy, it was working, and then somebody else did something else and it didn't work so well, or ran a political. I raised the money for a U.S. senator running for a long time, who was ahead and was doing great. And one night he was having a drink with he was rich, very rich, and his wife was a lot richer. And one night he was having a drink with a reporter who was a good friend, and the guy said, there's a lot of discussion that you didn't pay any income tax. And he and his wife had just given a huge contribution to a Christian college, which they did not want publicized. And so the senator said, hey, that's bullshit. I paid $2,000 in taxes. Of course, the headline was he only paid $2,000 in taxes, and it cost him a lot. And then Jimmy Carter swept Tennessee, which shows you how long ago this was. But you just have to you have to do the best you can in situations like that. You're not always going to win. Mm-hmm. But you're always trying to maximize the probability of a win, and you just accept, as Annie said, I had a hand that 72% of the time should have won, and I went all in and it lost. That means 72% of the time I would have won. And the key is to have and this is an interesting, I love that book, but I haven't read it for a while. I think this is something that businesses also don't think about very often, which is how much can I risk on this strategy? What is if, Lee Trevino, who's a famous golfer and grew up very poor, and used to say, people asked him about, he's won majors and a lot of tournaments, how do you handle the pressure in the U.S. Open, Lee? And Lee said, that is nothing compared to being in a bet where you lose. You're into the game for $50 and you only have $10 in your pocket. And I always thought that was an interesting way to. I don't know if you read this, but the CEO of Pfizer turned down the government money for the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. Turned down $1 billion. So this is not chump change. And they asked him, and they said, well, why did you turn down? He said, well, here's the deal. If Pfizer loses $1 billion, we will still be a great company. We'll still be in business. I probably won't have my job, but we'll be just fine. If we're successful, as I think we will when we get the vaccine, we'll make that money back many times over, which, of course, it turned out they did. But his analysis started off at a very interesting point, which was we can afford to lose the money. I'm not betting the company on this. I'm maybe my career, but he'd made a lot of money. But it's something that we don't think about oftentimes when we give clients advice. How much of the quote unquote capital are we asking them to put at risk, and how much are we saying? When I was at Pizza Hut, we launched a new product, and it turned out not to work. Long story, but the CFO, who was a wonderful human being, even though he was sort of jerk, came into a meeting one day and said, I hate this idea, but if it fails, we'll be okay. It was a very smart comment. So when you think about advice you give, you want to maximize the probability. You want to play the odds to be Annie Duke. You want to maximize the probability of a win, but you want to keep an eye on what happens if this all goes south. So are you going to be around to fight another day?
The first time, I don't know if you remember this, the first time I met you, I was running the business unit, the inside sales center for the chamber. And our COO, my boss, came in and said, hi, meet Bob. He's advisor of the CEO. And I said, okay. And I sat down and she said, hey, tell Bob about this thing you're working on. And we'd been trying to fix new membership for a while. And I said, all right, so I've got this idea. What we're going to do is I'm going to take my sales team down. And I laid it all out. And I said, it was creative. And I said, and I was really excited about it. I said, all right, this is it. In your words, you said, I don't think it's going to work, but you should do it. And I was like, who is this guy? What is like, because I had just met you. Like we hadn't even had a cup of coffee. But I look back on that and it's the exact right answer. Like I think the chances of this succeeding are low, but the upside is high. If it's a scalable way to bring on new customers, great. If it's not, if it doesn't pan out, whatever, you've got 10 more ideas. But at the time, I was in this world where I have one idea, I'm going to make it work. Like I wasn't necessarily thinking about it that way, but that was the very first, I think that was the first 5 minutes I ever met you. And I look back on that and I go, yes, it's the right answer. Even if you don't think the idea is going to work, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And even if you do think it's going to work, it doesn't mean you should. There's all these other variables that go into it.
Yeah. Thank Wayne Calloway for that advice.
Yeah. So it was good advice. I had a
former CEO of PepsiCo, just for the record.
You shared something a couple months ago with me. I don't actually have the link. I'll see if I can find it for the show notes, but it was an article about target markets. And this is another, this is the last of my gray area type of things, but it's okay. The article, in summary, my takeaway was we think about defining our niche or defining our target market as this kind of binary, define the firmographics, the demographics, like nail it down. And then that's who you're selling to. That's who you're marketing to. And you should always have that persona in your mind focused on your target market. But the gist of this article was picture, instead of saying that's the target market, picture that same persona or that same definition as the bullseye on a dartboard, and then draw circles around it and recognize that it's more probabilistic than it is deterministic. That's from the article. And meaning the further you get away from that bullseye, the less the likelihood that they will buy stuff from you is, or the less that they're going to be willing to pay for it. but it doesn't mean other people outside of that audience aren't going to be drawn to your product or to your service. And so there's some inherent, I don't know if danger is the right word, but you can get too narrow and think that you're only talking to one person when you don't recognize it's a whole dartboard that's probability based, not deterministic. And I say all that because in the context of you mentioned at the beginning of the show, like one of the things I tell people is you've got to understand who you're talking to. You've got to understand who you're marketing to. Otherwise, your messaging, if I'm everybody's consultant, I'm nobody's consultant. If I solve every problem, then I solve no problems. So there's this piece of needing to get narrow enough that your messaging resonates. And when somebody comes to your website, they can go, okay, this person can solve my problems. But there's also this process of figuring out who your market is, right? Like getting out into the market, solving some problems, finding where your specialties are, finding who your favorite clients are going to be. And so it's not as simple as you don't want to go so narrow at the onset that messaging is going to be right, but you're not really learning. You're not validating. You're not opening the net wide enough to take in new opportunities and learn about who you help best. But if you try to say, hey, I do this for everybody, your messaging is going to be so generic and so vanilla that you're never going to have the opportunity to help anybody worthwhile. Do you have how would you go about that if you were starting fresh today? Or does that question make sense?
Oh, it makes total sense. Well, back to what I said earlier. In the beginning, as you figure out your strategy, you're sort of a Roomba vacuum cleaner. Once you think you've done enough homework, and let's leave how you know that aside for a second, then you pick a target audience. And I now go back to crossing the chasm. No matter how narrow you start your target audience, the goal is to quickly move into adjacent target audiences. In other words, and this is an easy example because it's an easier example it's difficult to come up with many examples this simple. In the book, Moore talks about first you start with eyes, ear, nose, and throat doctors, and then you start with doctors of the upper chest, and then you start with head doctors, and eventually you have every doctor in the world. Mm-hmm. But you didn't start with doctors, and there's a long reason why he believes this. So the question is, once you get a target audience, I would try to sit down and say, what's my target audience? And then what's the slightly bigger target audience? And what's the slightly bigger target audience? If I read the headlines in your website, which I could pull up and read it, and then we could have this conversation. But how big is your target audience in the first place? And the real question I'd ask is, how do you make it small? And then as you get successful, how do you grow it organically? And I always think in my mind of a sparkler, which has all the excitement in the middle, but the little tails going around, picking up people farther out of mind on the dartboard. But the thesis is, how do you convince? Let's go back. This is a tactic we're talking about. What's the strategy? The strategy is, the question we're trying to answer is, how do I convince a company that I have the right solution for them, recognizing that there are very few. It's not like, how do I know that Aaron Judge is worth all that money with 5 seasons and he has all these statistics? That in selling consulting services, you rarely have that kind of clear, differentiated source. You sort of have to educate people that you're smart enough, and then talk to them and understand their problem, as you outlined so well. And then they hear the natural person because you've been through this process with them. And gee, Ray wrote some smart stuff. He asked me some great questions. He helped me think about my problem, and he solved that problem before. Mm-hmm. That's where the target audience is important. He solved that problem before. So as you get more and more problems you've solved, then you can start to expand your target audience. So you need to be thinking about, from a tactic perspective, let's go back to my movie theater. We didn't say we're only going to focus revenue marketing on new customers. We said we're going to spend 20% on getting current customers to come back, but we don't have to spend money because we see them. So when they come in the store, we come in the theater, we just have to make sure we give them something. We have, lots of in situ stuff we can do that's pretty inexpensive. We're going to spend 80% getting new customers. I would say 80% of your target marketing ought to be aimed on your target audience, and 20% ought to be aimed on a slightly bigger target audience. And the trick is not to go from the center of the dartboard all the way out here to the edge. Oh, look, I have somebody 47 light years from my target audience, but I think they like me. Let's go fart around over there. No, you want to move from the bullseye to one ring out. So you need some thought process how you're doing that. And is that what's the tactic to do that? And that's a growth strategy. And I would say that most entrepreneurs, most solo entrepreneurs, don't need much of a bigger target audience. They got enough people in their very narrow target audience that they can stay there. Because the farther you get, the less, like when I was at Calvin Klein, to go back to Calvin Klein, when we were selling $4,000 purses and $6,000 dresses, there's a certain group of people who have the interest in the financial wherewithal and the desire to buy that. But beyond that, you could say, well, try to get people just a little bit poorer or a little bit less fashion conscious or a little bit outside of a city that has cocktail parties where you have to dress up. Very expensive marketing. A long run for a short slide. So the first question I'd ask, to go back to your question, is how big is my little circle? And if there are a lot of companies in that little circle and I need 10 a year to be successful, so that means I need 150 over the next 15 years. If that's easily understood in my circle and it's probably renewing itself anyway, maybe I don't need to get bigger than my target audience. You and I, Ray, have talked about this. Growth is a very seductive thing. One of my buddies runs a little marketing company, and he's very straightforward. I want 5 clients a year. That's it. So if you try to find his website, you won't find it because he doesn't want it to be found, because that just generates a lot of incoming leads and questions from people that'll never hire him. And he's got a little group. He's got 20, 25 companies on his hit list, and he figures if he can get a fifth of them every year and he adds 5 and takes 5 off, he can run his business forever.
Yeah.
So you really have to go back to what's the strategy I'm trying to consider before you worry about how do I get farther out on the wheel.
It's a great way to put it. Because you say, how many people do you need? There's a lot of solopreneurs. You need, what is it? You need 8.3 people to pay you 10 grand a month to have $1 million business. It's not like you don't have to build these massive funnels. One thing and I think it's actually stems from that article. One thing I've started to think through is your audience that you sell to isn't always the exact same audience that you market to from a social media standpoint. Like the audience that I speak to on LinkedIn or on Twitter or something is actually intentionally wider than the number of people that are going to buy from me. There's people, executives that are aspiring to maybe one day go solo or do some consulting. There's people that just started out. There's like services that aren't quite as high, like all these other people that engage with my content. And that's what helps it get reach. Understanding who I write to from a marketing standpoint and what helps gets engagement and helps just the amount of audience that's going to hear my message by default increases the number of people in the bullseye that I'm going to talk to. But I know that everybody that engages with my content isn't going to buy my stuff. But recognizing you need a little bit of that, especially if you're doing organic marketing. If you only talk to a bullseye, then your content's not going to go anywhere.
And no bullseye can be that. No media is so targeted that you can define your bullseye that carefully. I think the illusion of target audience advertising is, I want a show that reaches 80% men. So that's football, but there's still 20% women that watch it, and they're going to watch your ads. And so it's easy to kid yourself that we're being really super highly targeted here, and your definition of your target audience is probably not that good. So when you use broader reach mediums, that's good news, because a lot of this is name awareness.
Right.
Thinks about Ray, and they go call one of their buddies up, hey, you heard of this guy named Ray Green? And if they say, yeah, I read his posts on LinkedIn, he may not be in your target, or she may not be in your target audience, but her reference is very important. So it's a gray area thing.
This is enlightening as always. I have one last question for you in signing off here. What's your favorite quote or the best piece of advice you've received?
I would say just do it.
Nike.
I would say Shy Day did not come up with that line. That's Wheaton and Kennedy. But I think that at the end of the day, mindless activity is not very valuable. And you can certainly, as I hope I've made clear in this conversation, lots of ways to maximize the value. But at the end of the day, you got to go do it.
That's how we learn. Learn more from action than we do sitting around batting ideas around in our head, circling the drain.
Yep. Everything has a time, but at the end of the day, my wife came to the gym the other day, and just as I was working out with my trainer, and she got there a few minutes early, so my trainer walked over and said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "God, you almost killed him." And I said, honey, I can stand around by myself. I don't need anyone to pay me to do that. Perfectly capable of sitting in this gym for an hour and not breaking a sweat and being perfectly content. I need somebody I pay him to chase me down and make me work my butt off. And I think that's a reflection of most human beings.
It's why we have jobs as coaches and consultants half the time.
Yep.
I appreciate your time, Bob. Love having you join.
Always fun. Give my best to Sam. Give my best to the kids.
Likewise, give my best to Joni.
Yeah.
Hope
she's fun.
Hope everything's going well.
And we'll cross paths at some point. Here's to a great 2023 for you and everybody we work with.
That's right. It's going to be a fun year. Thanks for your time. Adios.